701 years before the time of Christ, the Assyrian king Sennacherib came down from the north, conquering the cities of Judah, one after another. His ultimate objective was back up there in the Judean hills, the city of Jerusalem, where King Hezekiah prepared for the inevitable siege that he knew was coming. But before Sennacherib could go up there, he had to conquer the formidably defended city of Lachish. During the conquest, his army built this siege ramp all the way up to the top of the walls of Lachish. We know about it from three sources. One, the Bible. Two, King Sennacherib himself decorated his palace with images of the conquest of this city. Finally, archaeologists today come and dig in this archaeological treasure to find out even more information about the momentous events of that time. We're going to meet Dr. Michael Hasel of Southern Adventist University, one of the leaders of the 4th archaeological expedition to Lachish.
One of the amazing contributions of the 4th expedition to Lachish is the discovery that we made of the actual size of the site during what we call level 2, which is the 6th and 7th centuries BC, the time just before Nebuchadnezzar's final invasion. This, of course, is the time we think of when we think of Daniel and his friends being carried off into captivity, where we see the destruction of the temple that had stood for almost 400 years, where we see the exile taking place and thousands of people going to Babylon at the end of that time period. The site was massively destroyed, we know that. But how extensive was the site? Previous expeditions had concluded that the site maybe was not very extensively occupied during this time. But we've now been able to show that not only was the site occupied during this time with an extensive gate system, we've now also been able to reestablish a fortification line all the way around the site. And we are finding really incredible amounts of material. One of the amazing discoveries that we made just last year was that we found a pot, a large vessel filled with iron tools. And on the outside of the pot was a seal impression, and that seal impression named an individual. What is even more fascinating is that a few meters away from where that pot was found, a little dipper juglet was found in the 1960s with 17 seal impressions inside that little dipper juglet. And one of those seal impressions mentions the same individual. It's only found a few meters away. So that raises a question. Are we dealing with a house that we can actually identify the owner of? How the early kingdom of Judah developed has been part of our research goals and design for the last 11 years, and Lachish has just been an amazing site. The second most important city really in Judah after Jerusalem, and we're looking at that city now and trying to figure out, going back to those earliest levels of the Iron Age, of the early kingdom, and seeing how that traces over time. We have a number of scholars in more recent years that have proposed a low chronology, that have basically removed any history for Judah prior to the 8th century. That is, the whole early monarchy period of Saul and David and Solomon and Rehoboam have pretty much been removed. They begin with Ahab, and they begin with a later period of Israel's history. So we now have been able to show through new scientific work that these periods did exist, and that there's a continuity in development of fortifications, of architecture, of writing, of social networking that is taking place, of trade. All of these are significant connections between different sites and within the growth trajectory of what we have in this period. And we can connect now, I believe, these sites with Jerusalem. I've always been fascinated with history, and so archaeology and history are tied very closely together. But I also grew up as a Christian, and for me, the connections between archaeology and the Bible were always something very real. My father was an Old Testament scholar. My first trip with my dad by myself was to the Middle East when I was 17 years of age. It opened my eyes to a whole new dimension and reality to the biblical world that I'd never experienced before. That was probably the beginning point of me thinking about the future of my work in archaeology and biblical archaeology in particular. The Bible came to life in a way that it had never come to life before.
Dr. Hasel's father was a prominent Christian theologian. He believed that the Bible was true. So when Dr. Hasel decided to study archaeology, was he testing his father's belief in the Bible, or was he trying to prove his belief true?
Growing up in a Christian family and a Christian community, it's sometimes difficult in that context to really specify a specific point of when one becomes a Christian. But then when I started college, a lot of bigger questions started emerging that began to challenge some of those foundational decisions that I'd made. And I was studying abroad in Europe for a year. I had an opportunity to go home for Christmas. I made it a matter of prayer. And I had about 3 hours to make a decision before my dad called back, and came to the conclusion that I needed to stay. There was just a peace about staying that I felt was there. And whenever I felt about going home, it was a lack of peace. That's the best way I can describe it. So I decided to stay. A few weeks later, I learned that the flight that he had me booked on was Pan Am Flight 103 that crashed in Lockerbie, Scotland. And that was a life-changing moment in my life. And I remember for months after that asking why did I survive and not take that flight? And, that was a real turning point in asking some very big fundamental questions that I had to wrestle with that year. And I went to the Bible, and I found in Scripture many of the answers to those questions. And it was an awakening time for me to understand, for the first time, I needed to really know for myself who I was as a Christian and whether this was something that I was going to buy into. The university that I attended for my undergraduate and for my first master's degree was a Christian university, Andrews University, and it was very influential in forming and developing my ideas about archaeology, about the Bible, about biblical backgrounds. I had the opportunity to volunteer and work at the Archaeological Museum on campus. I started going on excavations during that time. Every single summer, every opportunity I had, I would go on an excavation project. And sometimes I would go on two. I was on my first excavation project ever in Israel in 1990. And I had been working there with Professor William Deaver, who was the chair of the Near Eastern Studies program at Arizona. And one evening over dinner, Professor Deaver said, "I understand you want to go into archaeology in the future. Would you be interested in the University of Arizona?" Arizona was a great experience in many ways, but it was also challenging. I was going from a Christian worldview now to a completely secular worldview. And I knew that would happen intellectually and theoretically, but I didn't know exactly what it would be like in the context. And I remember my first class, one of my first classes that fall semester, the professor got up at the very beginning of class and he said, "I know many of you are coming out of synagogues and churches, and many of you are here for the first time at a state university, and you've learned about the Bible in a certain way, in a certain perspective," he said, "but now you're at a state university and we're gonna discover what really happened." There were students that would leave that class crying because the rug of faith was being basically pulled out from under them. And I basically made a daily decision to evaluate everything that I was learning on the basis of Scripture. While it challenged my faith, it also helped my faith grow tremendously. I tell students today that I think I studied twice as hard as other students did, because I not only had to learn the material I was learning, but I had to study how this lined up with what I knew and what I understood from a biblical perspective. You know, I didn't have answers for everything. I still don't have answers for everything. This is one of the delights of further investigation and further scientific inquiry. As I've studied other world religions, the Bible is unique in two specific ways. It's a collection of books that is constituted in history. I don't know of any other major religious book or a collection of books out there that has that major focus and focal point. It's really the only book that you can go to scientifically and evaluate based on the historical evidence that is out there. What makes it so fascinating to me in my faith is that I can go to an ancient site, I can handle the actual material, whether those are pots, whether those are inscriptions, whether those are seals or stamps of seals. It makes it three-dimensional. And in that way, it's not simply a philosophical, esoteric idea that is somewhat abstract that you wonder about. Archaeology, what it does is that it makes what we read about in the Bible tangible and real. And for the first time, it's not simply a city that you mispronounce and you have no idea where it exists and how it relates to the wider picture of the Bible when you're reading a biblical story. Now you've been to that city, you've excavated that city, you've found the houses of the people that live in that city, and you've been able to reconstruct, in a sense, what their life might have been like. So archaeology, in that sense, puts a reality behind something that you've read about as stories over a course of years, if you've grown up as a Christian or if you've grown up in a Jewish home. But now, for the first time, there's something behind those stories. Lachish is an extremely important site as we look at its history, and as we realize that there's city after city after city that is superimposed on top of each other. From earlier Canaanite periods, we refer to it as the Middle Bronze Age and the Late Bronze Age. These are periods where the city is expanded and is a major fortification. It's a major city-state during that time period. This is the time period of the patriarchs in terms of the biblical period. Later, during the conquest, it is one of the cities that forms a coalition against Israel, which is invading under the leadership of Joshua. And in the famous story of Joshua and the sun standing still, the king of Lachish is one of those antagonists in that story. Then it is not mentioned for about 200, 300 years until the time of Rehoboam, the son of Solomon, who is said to refortify the city of Lachish. And it becomes a very important, fortified, royal city in Judah. We would probably say the second most important city in Judah after Jerusalem. And we have evidence for that in a number of biblical passages. When Amaziah, the king of Judah, flees for his life from Jerusalem because of a coup attempt on his life, where does he go to? He goes to the site of Lachish, and the Bible tells us the people find him there, they kill him, and they take his body back to Jerusalem. When the invasions take place of Judah under Sennacherib, the Assyrian king, and then under Nebuchadnezzar again, what city is mentioned in those passages in Scripture before attacking Jerusalem? The penultimate city before attacking Jerusalem is Lachish. So the site is mentioned 23 times in the Old Testament. It's a major city in Judah, and it was a fortification that guarded one of the main access roads up to Jerusalem, up to the hill country. So if the Egyptian king coming from the south, or the Babylonian and Assyrian kings coming from the north, or the Philistines coming from the west, if any of them were going to make any attempt to attack Jerusalem, they would have to encounter Lachish first. One of the contributions to the fourth expedition of Lachish was to accomplish what our original research goal was, and that was to actually excavate levels 4 and 5. These are the levels that date to the time of the 9th and late 10th century BC. These are the levels that go back to the earliest part of the monarchy, at least as far as Lachish goes. And one of the big questions that was raised in the past, was there an extensive settlement at the site? We only have one passage in Chronicles mentioning that Rehoboam fortifies or builds walls around a series of cities, and Lachish is mentioned in that passage. But up to this point in time, none of the previous expeditions had found city walls dating to the time of Rehoboam. So one of the goals that we had was to go back to Lachish and to examine the fortification system and see what the sequence of walls there actually was. And we accomplished that over this period of 5 years that we were working there. And in the last 2 seasons, we began to excavate a massive wall sandwiched between the level 6 wall and the level 3 and 4 wall. We have now a level 5 wall with a wonderful floor extended to it, with beautiful houses abutting this wall, and with a number of important olive pits that we were able to send in for dating to Oxford University. That has nailed down the date not only of the wall, but it has nailed down the possibility that it actually might have been there and then potentially perhaps could have even been built by Rehoboam.
Becoming an archaeologist is not a trivial undertaking. It takes years of education and experience, but in the hands of an archaeologist, a piece of pottery like this, found in context and examined with the appropriate knowledge, becomes a window into the past.
Archaeology is often filled with surprises, and one of the surprises that came in the season of 2014 was one of the most important discoveries I think that we made, particularly as it relates to the Bible. We were excavating a massive destruction from the time of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king. We know that the Assyrian king not only attacked the city of Lachish, but destroyed it based on previous expeditions and also based on his own records, which mention very clearly his campaign against Judah. The account is also described in 3 different books of the Bible, in Isaiah, in Kings, and Chronicles, in quite some detail. Lachish is specifically mentioned, although the major focus of the biblical account is on Jerusalem and God's deliverance of Jerusalem before the Assyrian king. Lachish is also shown in the palace of Sennacherib, and those reliefs show his attack with battering ram after battering ram going up against the city. And so as we're excavating this major destruction level and we're finding sling stones, dozens of them, and pieces of mail, Assyrian mail, and arrowheads and all kinds of evidence for a massive destruction, in that destruction debris we find a little tiny dipper juglet. This is a little measuring cup. And as we pick up that dipper juglet, and my daughter was one of the individuals that was involved in that, which was kind of neat, as they were looking at this dipper juglet and then carefully emptying its contents, we found a seal impression. We call it a bulla. And we immediately stopped what we were doing and we began sifting the material that was excavated around this object, and we found 2 more. And then we sent all of the material off to Jerusalem for wet sifting, and they found another seal in the same material. So we have 4 seals probably coming out of the same dipper juglet, because they would place these seal impressions in there as kind of a return receipt or a proof that they received the document that was sealed. And these tiny seal impressions are no larger than your pinky fingernail, or maybe your thumbnail, and they show on them the name of the person who was sending a document to the site. And we could read it in the field. It was that clear. It was incredible. And we know it says Eliakim, the son of Yehuzarach, or belonging to Eliakim, the son of Yehuzarach. Very important. We have Eliakim mentioned in the Bible in several passages, but there is one Eliakim in particular that is mentioned in the time of Hezekiah, in the time of this destruction. And that Eliakim is the chief steward of the palace in Jerusalem. And here we have the evidence of a document sent by him to the second most important city of Lachish. We believe it may be the same Eliakim, although we cannot be 100% certain, based on a number of aspects to the study that we have been conducting. And if this is the case, then it's the first time we've ever found evidence for Eliakim, the chief steward of Hezekiah's palace, here at the site. And that provides a triangulation of names. We know that Sennacherib campaigned here. We have found his name in his own reliefs and in various contexts. We have Hezekiah mentioned by Sennacherib by name. We have a seal of Hezekiah's father, Ahaz, mentioning him by name. And now we have a person very high in the government of Judah, Eliakim, mentioned also by name. And that gets almost as good as reaching back and shaking somebody's hand. So while we were there at the site, we were excavating and we suddenly come across a jar. And this large storage jar obviously contains handles, and on these handles we find a stamp that says at the top, Lamelech, or for the king, or to the king. And on the bottom often mentions the name of a city, in this case, Hebron. They testify to an extravagant taxation system in the 8th century that ties specifically back to King Hezekiah and help us date this level. So finding Lamelech jar handles is almost like finding a coin that says 701 BC on it, or at least that says the 8th century on it, and helps us tie it directly back to the time of Sennacherib, the Assyrian king's campaign, and the time of Hezekiah, the king of Judah. Sennacherib is one of the most powerful kings of ancient Assyria, and he comes with one goal in mind, and that is to conquer Egypt. If Assyria could conquer Egypt, that was the prize that every Mesopotamian king was looking forward to. There's only one problem. Standing between Assyria and Egypt is the kingdom of Judah. Israel has already been taken away into captivity in 722 BC, and now it's 701 BC, 21 years later, and Sennacherib has this territory to conquer. He comes down with his armies and he conquers a number of various cities. And the last city he must conquer before going up to Jerusalem is the site of Lachish, again testifying to its importance in the geopolitical sphere of ancient Judah. And he sets up his camp and he oversees that whole building of a massive siege ramp, which we've excavated there at the site. He oversees the whole operation from his vantage point. The site is completely destroyed, and then his armies head up to Jerusalem next, where the terms of the siege are given to the individual standing on the walls, and one of those people standing on the walls is Eliakim, the steward of the household. And the Bible goes on to describe that night the angel of the Lord comes down, and when the Judeans wake up the next morning in their city, they look out past the walls of the city and they see a dead Assyrian army out there. So this is a miraculous deliverance of Jerusalem. Interestingly enough, in Sennacherib's palace, Jerusalem is not depicted. Only Lachish is depicted in his throne room as being conquered. And so the focal point that Sennacherib gives primarily is on Lachish. The focal point that the Bible gives primarily is on the deliverance of Jerusalem, the capital city of that kingdom. Many times the negative views towards the Bible and towards Scripture are coming out of a very positivist kind of agenda where if you don't see evidence for something, it didn't happen. And I call this a negative argument. A negative argument really isn't an argument at all, and an argument from silence isn't really based on any data, it's based on the lack of data. So I think one of the important things that archaeology contributes is that we can actually look at data and we can produce new data by going into the field and excavating. Just to give you an example, David as a person, there was a book published in 1992, which said, we have no evidence in the archaeological record as yet for David and Solomon's existence. And the author then made the argument that David probably was no more historical than the mythical King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Well, 1 year later, an inscription was found, the famous Tel Dan inscription mentioning the House of David, 1 year after his book was published. I think we need to be very, very careful not to make those kinds of fallacious arguments, because there are hundreds of archaeologists working in the field every year, and we never know what kind of data will come out the next year to give new insights into the world of the ancient Near East, and particularly the world of the Bible.
There's a school of thought that says, unless archaeological evidence somehow or other supports the history that was recorded in the Bible, it's untrustworthy in some way. It's interesting to note that when archaeologists like Dr. Hasel do test the record of Scripture against the empirical evidence, the Bible comes out remarkably well.